Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about how to do 4 voice realizations. So basically we're going to keep this simple. We're going to do soprano, alto, tenor, bass, but we're only going to do root position chords and we're only going to use 1 and 5. So probably going to go from 1 to the next. So here we go from 1 in C major to 5 based on the G and back to 1 to 5 to 1 to 5. So the idea with 4 voice realization is that you want to have 4 individual melodies going on at a time. So let's listen to this. You'll notice that the chords just go back and forth between that C major chord and the G major chord. Think about what keeps it interesting. It could be so boring, right? And it's at least a little bit interesting. And that's because each part has been written to have its own shape and its own melody. So the soprano part has a high point over here at the beginning. It's singable. That's one of the things we're absolutely going to try to get every time we write these. We want to have singable lines. The alto is also... It's okay, you know. It's the alto and the tenor voices may not matter quite as much in terms of their interestingness as the soprano and the bass, because the way we hear music is we hear the soprano and the bass first, and then we kind of hear the middle as one mushy thing because we can only hear 3 things at a time. So how do we do these? We start with the soprano line first against the bass, and then we write the alto line and the tenor line, or if you prefer the tenor line, then the alto line. But you always want to write the outer voices first because those are the ones we perceive. So we've talked about parallel fifths and octaves. You want to avoid those at all costs, as well as hidden fifths and octaves. Something that we didn't talk about so far is the leading tone. So the leading tone, as we mentioned in the consonance and dissonance video, has a really strong tendency to want to go back to the tonic. So that B here really wants to go to C. And so anytime you have that leading tone in a 5 chord or a 7 diminished chord, in one of those outer voices, you're going to really want to resolve that to scale degree 1. It's going to sound really bad if you don't. So listen to this if we have it go down to the G, say. Just doesn't sound right? So having it go back up to the C makes it sound like we're fulfilling that tendency that leading tone has. Now in the inner voices, in a perfect world, all of those tendency tones would also resolve up, but there's a lot of times when that becomes more of an issue than it's worth, and so in those inner voices, it's okay if that leading tone doesn't resolve up, but you should always try. Always try. Okay, another thing that we want to really pay attention to is spacing. We shouldn't have more than an octave between the tenor and the alto, or more than an octave between the alto and the soprano, because that makes them feel like one of them's off in its own world, and we don't feel like it's one cohesive texture. So if I had the tenor way down here on that E, we would have a spacing issue because there'd be more than an octave between the tenor and the alto. The 2 voices that this doesn't really apply to are the tenor and the bass, because the bass, you can have as much space as you want, probably up to 2 octaves. That doesn't matter. That sort of gives a nice foundation to the whole thing. But for those upper 3 voices, never more than an octave between the tenor and the alto, never more than an octave between the alto and the soprano. Finally, let's talk a little bit about doubling. A lot of the time, your voice leading is going to help you decide what to double. You want to keep your lines as smooth as possible and avoid too many awkward jumps. So if you have to make a choice, what you should go with first is the root, and then the 5th, and then last the 3rd. So if you have a choice and you can pick the root, then I would pick the root. Otherwise, try and pick the 5th. And then as a last resort, pick the 3rd. There are a couple of places where that's maybe the rules for that get a little bit different. We'll deal with those as we find them. One that we'll look at right now is with that leading tone. We never want to double the leading tone. It has such a strong tendency to go up to the first scale degree that if you have two of them, it sounds weird if it doesn't. So yeah, don't double the leading tone, otherwise double judiciously. So let's give this a try. Here I have a little bit of a shorter one. This time I'm going to start on the C. So the first step is always to do the soprano voice first. You want it to be, the soprano and the bass motion to be as compatible as possible so that it sounds good. If they're doing wacky things, it's not going to sound good. So let's start with the C. Now we have a choice. We can go down to the B or up to the D. A lot of the time with the soprano and the bass, you're going to want to go in contrary motion. So while the B would have been okay, it would have meant we had to go back to C. It's probably better for us right here to go in the opposite direction that the bass is going. So that gives us a nice shape. Now we could go back to C again, but that possibly gets us into the trap of our melody line being too static. So let's go up to the E, and then we'll come down to the D. We couldn't go, I guess we could go up to the G, but then we're starting to get a little bit high. Got to remember when you're writing these things, we might sing them in class and you don't want to make the sopranos work too hard. I'll get mad at you. And then we have the D, and then we'll come back down to the C again. It's always good to try and end these with perfect authentic cadences, which is a thing. As I say it, I realize we haven't talked about yet, but we will soon, don't worry. Okay, so let's make sure that these two voices sound nice together. It's alright. We have a nice high point in the soprano, and this is a very short example, so it's not like we're going to win any Grammys for our melodic writing. Okay, so now that we've done those, let's see if we can write the alto line. And as we're doing this, of course, we're paying attention, making sure that we don't write any parallel fifths or octaves or hidden fifths and octaves. So the only place where that could have happened, well, I guess we could have had a hidden fifth, but we're stepping into it. We're stepping into that fifth, and then we're stepping into the octave in the soprano. So that's all okay. So let's try that alto voice. Let's start the alto on an E. If we start the tenor on an E, it could get very high for them very quickly. So for the same reason that we don't want to take the sopranos too high, let's try and keep the tenors in a reasonable range. So let's see. We next need a G major chord. So we need a G, B, and a D. Let's go up to the G so that we don't build too much space between the alto and the soprano, because we want to keep that to an octave. Okay, so now we're getting to a point where we can go with rule of thumb number 1. If you can leave one of these inner voices where it is, you should. So here we need a G still. So let's just leave the alto voice there. It's not very interesting, but it makes for very easy voice leading, because we're not going to have any parallels if we've got the note not moving anywhere, right? So stay on the G. We could stay on the G again, and oh my gosh, we'll see if that works. I'm sorry, altos, that's a very boring line, but it's okay. Alright, so let's see. We need now a G in the tenor. That finishes our chord, so we have C, E, and G. Okay, so now we're missing a B in this line. So we need a G, B, and D. Now here is a case where the leading tone is in one of the inner voices. It doesn't have to go up, but in this case I think it's probably nice if it does. Okay, so as we're doing this, we're scanning and making sure that we're not adding any parallels. And then, should we go down to the G? Oh, no, what's wrong with that? Yes, well, first of all, we haven't got a complete chord there. You can omit the fifth when you're doing full voice writing and it's in root position, but you cannot omit the third or the root. So first of all, we need a third in there. Second, there's a parallel octave between the tenor and the bass in that part. So we're going to go to the C, and this is where we get into a little bit of trouble. The B really wants to go back to the C, but we can go somewhere else because it's in an inner voice. But this chord needs a third still. So what I'm going to suggest is just tweaking the alto line a bit. Don't be afraid to tweak a line to make another line work, as long as you're not introducing new problems. And then this leading tone, instead of going up to the C, we'll go down to the G, and we'll have a nice fifth there. So this chord now is complete, has the root, the third, and the fifth. So let's listen to this, see what it sounds like. Yeah, it's not bad, right? So rule of thumb number 1, if you can stay on the same note, then you should, especially in those inner voices. Rule of thumb number 2, if you have a leading tone in an outer voice, you have to resolve it up if it's in a 5 chord, in a dominant function chord. If it's in an inner voice, you should try, but if it doesn't work, if it's better to have the full chord, then it's not going to ruin anybody's day. Spacing, make sure there's not more than an octave between the tenor and the alto and the soprano, and you're going to avoid all those parallels. No parallel fifths, no parallel octaves, no hidden fifths, no hidden octaves. Okay, so this is our first attempt at this. We're going to keep trying in class. We'll see how we do, and we'll be doing this for a while to come.